Born in London shortly before World War II, Hazel moved with her family to the south coast of England, where she grew up in a seaside village. After graduating from Reading University with an honours degree in English language and literature, she became a qualified teacher and has taught English in several Hertfordshire schools and colleges, as well as adult evening classes. While staying at home to bring up her 3 children, she began working freelance for publishers, chiefly as an indexer, and has now compiled more than 700 published indexes to books and journals. She was editor of the national newsletter of National Housewives Register from 1972 to 1976. From 1987 to 1996, Learned Publishing, the journal of the Association of Learned and Professional Society Publishers, as well as of The Indexer from 1978 to 1995. In 1997, Hazel received the Carey Award for services to indexing, and was awarded the Wheatley Medal for an outstanding index in both 2005 and 2006. She has written many articles, reports and reviews for journals including, as well as those she edited, Journal of Scholarly Publishing, Logos, Serials, Library Management, Managing Information, New Books, and The Open Book, the Journal of the Alliance of Literary Societies. She has also written books, including Indexing Biographies and Other Stories of Human Lives, Indexers and Indexes in Fact and Fiction, From Flockbeds to Professionalism, A History of Index Makers, and A Stage Mother's Story, We're Not All Mrs. Worthingtons. In 2006, Hazel registered as a publisher under the imprint HKB Press. She continues to publish, index, and edit from the family home in Hatfield.
Good morning. I'm afraid it's useless for me to ask, can you hear me at the back? But I do hope that you can both hear me and see me. I wish I could be with you. I was recently asked in the Society of Indexer survey, what's the most important piece of advice you would give to someone starting out as an indexer? I've replied, as it's now nearly 50 years since I started, it's an entirely different world. I wouldn't presume to offer advice to a beginner today. I will tell you of indexing as it was practiced when I took up the craft myself, of the development of the Society of Indexers from that time, and the editing of the Indexer from the 70s to the 90s. I joined the Society myself in its 7th year, 1965, in a scene nearly as different from today socially as it was technically. I had left university in 1957 with 3 black marks against me for the employment market. I was a woman, an arts graduate, and married. No employer wanted such a creature. My husband attracted some admiration even for condoning my search for work. It was not accepted on all sides at that time that wives might take work outside the home. Eventually I did find a job as a proofreader in a printing press, one that was producing scholarly editions of the works of Pope and Shakespeare, but quickly lost it again as the Printers' Union restricted the work to males who had served a 7-year apprenticeship, which I was not and had not. I took a series of odd jobs, eventually being accepted as a teacher, untrained. I then gave up outside work to produce and bring up my children. When my first son started attending nursery school in 1964, and his younger brother slept at that time, giving me some precious hours to myself, I began to feel the need for some form of skilled work that I could do at home, both financially and to preserve some sort of grip on sanity and the world outside. I saw reports in the papers of the agencies which were being set up then to provide part-time work at home for women in my position, such as AFEM, A-F-E-M, Agency for the Employment of Mothers Limited. The types of work they offered included indexing. To a compulsive list maker, crossword puzzle addict, and tracer of single themes through literary works, this seemed tailor-made for me. The Society of Indexers was founded in 1957, after Guildford Norman Knight, a former barrister and civil servant who had been a freelance solitary indexer for the previous 30 years, wrote to the Times Literary Supplement suggesting the formation of such a society. Replies came in. Knight invited the writers to luncheon at his London club, and the Society of Indexers, which I will henceforth refer to as SI, was inaugurated 15 months later at a meeting held at the National Book League, with 134 individual members and 23 institutional. It was hailed by a leading article in the Times, celebrating the newly formed Society of Indexers. In March, the first issue of the Indexer appeared, 1958, boasting a page-long message from the Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan. I wrote to SI to ask how to start being an indexer and received a helpful letter from the then Secretary Alan Baker. He told me there is no formal training for indexing work, recommending that beginners should read 4 books: Gordon Carey's Making an Index, the British Standard 377 1964, Recommendations for the Preparation of Indexes, and 2 by Robert Collison, Indexes and Indexing, and Indexing Books. About fees, he wrote, "Fees for indexing are very difficult to fix because there are so many variables. As a rough guide, we recommend payment by the hour. For a light work requiring no more than an index of names, you recommend a minimum of 10 shillings per hour. That's 50p today. For works of semi-scholarship requiring an index of names and concepts, 12 and 6pence per hour. And for works of scholarship requiring specialist knowledge, 15 shillings. That's 75p per hour." I studied the 4 books and sent off letters to publishers seeking commissions. My pleas were luckily successful, and I was asked to index a biography of the first woman doctor in England. It was necessary to provide myself with the tools of my new trade. This was, of course, long before the advent of personal computers. Indexers mostly worked on cards, mostly 5 by 3 inch, writing an entry on a card and arranging them in alphabetical order in wooden or metal trays that were nicknamed shoeboxes. A historical artefact, a shoebox index tray. They were nicknamed shoeboxes, or indeed you could use actual shoeboxes, which would serve the purpose well for as long as they lasted. I obtained cards by the hundreds, cut for me by printers. Indexers would also buy tabbed cards to mark the alphabetical division of the set of cards in the tray. And I used coloured cards for specific categories of entry, say blue for major entries, yellow for place names, green for book or journal titles. For economy, cards were reused. When a job was finished, the entries on the cards no longer needed for reference. A regular chore was to cross through the entries on the cards and turn them for reuse. For brief entries, the same cards could be used for 4 indexes, both sides, both ways up. Sets of index cards usually needed to be typed out on paper to send to the printer. Then typing was done noisily on manually operated typewriters with an inked ribbon running along the top for the metal letters to hit. When the ribbon was worn out, a new one had to be inserted, an intricate and messy procedure. If extra copies were needed, sheets of carbon paper had to be placed between the pages of typing paper. Tiny, flimsy pieces of special paper had to be placed above errors to type over again to correct them, on each copy separately. Then Tipp-Ex came on the market, little bottles of opaque white fluid that you painted over typing errors. Eventually, electric typewriters made typing easier and faster, and at last the photocopier offered an alternative to the use of carbon paper. To get photocopies, I had to find out which local shops or offices provided this service and take my original there, paying 10p or 12p per sheet. Even typing seemed advanced technology. Looking through old files to prepare this talk, I was surprised and frustrated to find out how many letters from society officers were handwritten. I worked exhaustively on that first index and sent the extremely over-detailed result to the author, who wrote to me, "I have checked through the index and it seems to me admirable. If you want at any time to give my name as a reference to publishers or authors, please do." Triumphantly, I sent off applications for work citing this reference and indeed obtained further commissions. But 11 days after the author's letter, I received another from the publishers, quite different in tone. We had it cast off by the printer. It makes 20 pages of 2 columns, small print. This is far too much. It is much too detailed for any likely reader or consulter of the book. The book was published with a 10-page index, not reduced by me. Perhaps this illustrates 2 received truths about indexing: that novice indexers tend to over-index, and that authors may regard no detail of their work as too insignificant to be indexed. I was then able, though, to write to the women's homework agencies saying that I had had an index published and received work from these sources, with the agencies taking their commission from the pay. I also obtained work through the Society of Indexers panel that recommended indexes to publishers. Indexing at home with small children did, of course, have its own problems. Not fiddling with mummy's cards was their major taboo, especially after one child was found about to extract all the pink ones from a set ready for typing. They had their own indexes, old cards of mine in shoe boxes, which they removed, scribbled on, and replaced as to the manner born, which indeed they were. A 2-year-old made a great impression at the infant clinic, looking at a tray of record cards and lisping, "Is that the lady's index?" At that time there were many women so placed. Indexing was in part a cottage industry, its freelance practitioners predominantly female, working at home. Even the words pin money were sometimes heard. When my youngest child started school in 1973, I had compiled 88 indexes, and found the work and its circumstances so congenial that I did not return to full-time teaching as planned, but remained a home-based freelance indexer. I came to prefer and to list as my subject specialisms humanities, narrative texts, biographies and histories which treat of people, their experience and relationships. I call these soft texts, as distinct from the dry, documentary texts of science, technology and medicine, which are composed of discrete, that's ending with ETE, units, and usually have standardized terminology and established formal structure. I particularly enjoyed the devising of subtle subheadings for individual situations in soft texts, which, as Hans Wellisch wrote, provide an opportunity for the indexer to be creative in paraphrasing the text, supplying terms that express the context concisely and precisely, and match the tenor of the text. A disadvantage of indexing personal text is that it can lead to feelings of guilt at invading privacy or causing distress. Indexing a history of the World War II resistance movement based on newly accessed records, I was horribly aware that the relatives of Gestapo victims might learn here for the first time the exact awful details of their fates. Indexing the love letters of a mystic poet, intended for no third eye, let alone publication, made me feel a most intrusive voyeur, as I sought to reduce outpourings of spiritual ecstasy to precise terms. That index, though, did bring about a memorable sequel. I was invited to the press launch of the book and introduced to the editor, a florid Lebanese. He bowed low and profusely kissed my hand as he said, "For your beautiful index." The development of the Society of Indexers did not tally with its august origins, London clubs, National Book Lead, Times Leader, letter from the Prime Minister. It was small and voluntary. It had no premises. Meetings were held in London, usually as guests of the Library Association, or for small committees in members' houses. I lived 20 miles north of London and could attend the meetings. In 1976, I was appointed a member of the Board of Assessors that considered whether indexes submitted by members showed them to be worthy of registration. Thus, I first got to know those stalwart personalities, the indefatigable and ebullient John Gordon, the vigorous and forthright Elizabeth Wallace, and surely the world's most fanatic, dogmatic proofreader, Neil Fiske. This is a photocopy of a page proof for the indexer, corrected and returned by Neil. Communication between meetings was only by post or telephone. We had to watch expenses carefully and tried to make long-distance calls only in off-peak periods, that is, out of office hours, when the home-based are trying to lead their home lives, their working papers put away. Publications relevant for many of us to read had to be passed on from reader to reader by post, expensively, with about a week between each name on the circulation list. 1978, the 21st year of SI, was cataclysmic, both for the Society and for my own involvement with it. First, Leonard Montague Howard, who had been editor of the Indexer for 14 years, suddenly resigned because of family circumstances. At the same time, his deputy editor, Mary Piggott, had sustained head injuries in a traffic accident and could not take over the journal. A new editor was needed. A call for nominations went out, accompanied by a list of requirements for the post, and I volunteered. My only editorial experience was with our local Consumer Groups magazine and the newsletter of National Housewives Register, both voluntary posts. But I found that I loved editing, assembling the parts, tailoring them, and arranging them to form a coherent whole, and eagerly seized the opportunity. So far as I know, there was no other candidate. I was elected Indexer editor in May 1978, which meant that I also became a member of SI's council. My predecessor as editor had given me 5 sheets of instructions, couched in spidery handwriting, so difficult to read that they could not be referred to for quick guidance. To know how long an article might prove in print, I had to cast off by counting the characters in each of 10 lines and multiplying the average by the estimated number of lines in the typescript. Make-up was done by cutting out the galley proofs with scissors and pasting them with cow gum onto page grids. In July 1978, the SI held its first international conference in Roehampton, South London, where I met Norman Knight, then in a wheelchair, as well as 2 speakers who were to become, in my view, the greatest contributors the Indexer has had, William Heckscher and Hans Willich. Born, respectively, in Germany and Austria before the rise of the Nazi Party, and both by then residents of the United States. The conference was also attended by representatives from the American Society of Indexers, which had affiliated to SI in 1972, that was Dorothy Thomas, from the Australian Society, which affiliated in 1977 and was represented by Jean Hacker, and the Indexing and Abstracting Society of Canada, represented by Peter Grieg, who all read congratulatory messages on SI's coming of age. Peter Grieg had several meetings with SI officers, and the affiliation of the Canadian Society to SI was settled during that conference. Volume 11, number 2 of the Indexer, the first issue under my editorship, was due for publication in October, and had the proceedings of this conference to prepare and include. The paper given by Hans Willich, Early Multilingual and Multiscript Indexes in Herbals, ran to 22 pages, including 10 illustrations, each with a caption, 21 footnotes, and 45 references with superscripts. I had never laid out anything so complicated, and indeed hadn't since. The instructions my predecessor as editor had given me did not cover my particular problem, editing a journal from a house with no spare room and with 3 children. I was able to devote attention to the journal only during the hours when the children were at school. I would spread typescripts, proofs, typewriter and tools over the dining table, clearing everything away as tea time approached. The journal production schedule was changed to avoid the busiest period coinciding with school holidays. The children tried to help, knowing they must not touch my papers or make noise during my phone calls, and doing their best to deal with these themselves when necessary. I came home once to find that my young daughter had taken a booking for an advertisement for a thesaurus, helpfully ascertaining and noting down for me, "It's a sort of book." Then, just as we finally went to press with the Indexer issue, including the conference proceedings, Norman Knight, SI founder president, died. So after all the trauma of getting my first issue into print, my next, volume 11, number 3, had to include an obituary and tributes for Knight. And we had to redesign the journal cover to take in the affiliation of the Canadian Society. In 1979, SI joined the Association of Learned and Professional Society Publishers, a body composed of the publishing arms of learned societies and professional institutions. We were members of Group A, the smallest category, those societies spending less than $10,000 a year on publication. SI was one of the few members that had no premises. Fellow institutional representatives asking where I was based, being told at home, would look politely surprised. Also in that year, our London-based treasurer resigned and was succeeded by one in Cambridge, where our secretary lived. I asked for the new treasurer's telephone number to be told, "The treasurer does not have a telephone, but the secretary has a bicycle." Then on to number 4 of my first index of volume, which had always included the volume index, prepared each year by a different member of SI. I was well aware that this commission might not be the honour it appeared. My predecessor as editor had once telephoned me and asked me to prepare the index to the current volume. I gasped, overwhelmed. "I think you ought to ask someone else." With a remarkable lack of tact, he told me, "I've already asked everyone else." I declined the commission. Now it was up to me to find a volume index and get his or her work into print in the final issue of the volume. It was over the indexing of each volume of the indexer that I came thoroughly to understand and even empathise with publishers' impatience with indexes. So on to 1980, my second indexer volume, when the printers of the indexer suffered a union go-slow. Then in 1981, we were again faced with provision of a volume index. John Gordon later wrote a splendid article on the variations of the indexer indexes, including, "For just over 2 decades, it was editorial policy to give each volume indexer extensive freedom to display his or her personal virtuosity. Each compilation has its own special qualities, revealing fascinating variations of style, of technique, of decision-making. It has indeed been said with pride that these indexes are living proof that indexing is an art rather than a science. Truly, they demonstrate how widely individual indexes may vary in the solution of particular